we had a chance to play Dino Crisis on the PS1 because it's among that list of like 20 to 30 games that people still talk about, right? Whether it be you should play that one, or you should remaster it, or you should remake it. But as many people point out, it's impossible to talk about survival horror games and not compare them to Resident Evil and Silent Hill, because those are the games, right? Those are the ones that's the measuring stick. Like, is this game as good as this or below it? So in this part of the conversation, we've reviewed Dino Crisis. Now we're going to be finally comparing that first game, which came out in 1999. So Keith, get ready. Ryan, I know you guys have been
Keith's ready to be unleashed right now.
Exactly. And specifically determining the pros and the cons. What are some of the things that Dino Crisis did either just as good or maybe even better than these other games? But then on the flip side, what are things that you're like, hey, at least this first game, nah. Now, Ryan, as the Silent Hill specialist of the conversation, what would you say that this game maybe did better than Silent Hill 1 or maybe even 2?
So I would say one thing that this game definitely did better than Silent Hill 1 or some of the other games in the series was there was actual decision making for your inventory. And I think that's one thing that I think Dino Crisis hits the best of both worlds is you have decision making with your ammo and your health items, but the key items that you need to actually progress in the game are in their own inventory that is like unlimited, which I appreciate because that's one of the like Silent Hill lets you carry everything all the time, and while that's convenient, I do think that makes it that kind of takes away, it takes an element out of survival horror of that style of inventory management. And Resident Evil does, like, it might be a little too strict with like, oh, I didn't have the crank with me, now I have to go all the way back, and that really sucks. Whereas I think Dino Crisis hits that really nice balance.
True. In your case, Keith, as the three of us have played, the games we're comparing it to, what do you think about the item management part of Dino Crisis?
Yeah, it was good. Like you said, it was restrictive, but not overly restrictive in a lot of ways that you didn't have to choose between the key items and the ammo and health items that much in the game. So it lets you like maximize your tools while at the same time not giving you too much of them, right? Like you never really feel like, even like Ryan said, on the easier difficulties, you never really feel like you get to that point where you just have a ton of ammo and you can just mow down enemies. They give you like enough ammo and items to deal with like maybe a third of the stuff at all times, and they strike a really solid balance with that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, when talking about Resident Evil, you have been somebody that's always loved those games, and obviously we're talking about Capcom, so Silent Hill is like another company. Here is a company that, for so long, even just to bring up the context, when it comes to release dates, Resident Evil 1 came out in 1996, Resident Evil 2 came out in 98, Silent Hill and this game came out in 99, and then Resident Evil 3 came out just a couple of months after, in September 99. So as of the release of Dino Crisis 1, Resident Evil 3 hadn't come out, but is there something from RE2 or even 3 that you're like, hey, this game actually did a better job with that?
Well, I think when you look at the timeline of that, I think that's where the most interesting conversation of Dino Crisis lies. Like you said, it happens between Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. And if you look at the things that Dino Crisis does that differentiates itself from Resident Evil 2, having things like a more action focus to it, having split paths, having item combining and ways to manipulate your inventory to give you exactly what you need in that moment. Like, those are the things that differentiate Resident Evil 3 from Resident Evil 2. If you take the good parts of Dino Crisis, they took them and then they just brought them forward in the survival horror franchise. It almost felt very much like Dino Crisis was a testing ground, even though I know they were probably in development at the same time. It felt like it was a feature testing ground for how do we make Resident Evil 3 a quote-unquote better game. So that's what I find so fascinating about Dino Crisis, where you are able to you can see the development of the franchise happen there. And this isn't something that's exclusive to Dino Crisis 1 either. Like, if we're talking about 2 quickly, the big things that differentiate 2 from 1 is the fact it's got a more action focus. When you kill items, or when you kill enemies, you're given items and points. Those points are what you can convert into shop currency to buy and upgrade guns. Well, what other game did that?
Yeah, I was going to say
Resident Evil 4. Like, they took the things from Dino Crisis 2, and then they made it into Resident Evil 4. Like, that's kind of what the Dino Crisis franchise is, really, in the survival horror spectrum.
Well, so in many ways, it's like Dino Crisis was the necessary sacrifice, because, I mean, we haven't had any of these games for over a decade, but what you're saying, especially with, Capcom, is they took many of these elements, and, we referenced Dead Space in our just overall review. I guarantee you, if I went back and played Dead Space now after playing this, I'd be like, oh man, like, I can definitely feel the influences. And when you mentioned that was one of my favorite things with RE4, is collecting the currency, because I'm like, I gotta save that up. And it's people like to watch numbers go up. Now, something that I would love to compare when it comes to both Silent Hill and Resident Evil that I thought this game did better, and I was kind of surprised by, because I had barely seen any gameplay, like to the point that I thought this was pre-rendered. I thought it was going to be RE stock. I'm like, Capcom, okay. The first thing that I see is like, no, it's kind of like Silent Hill, fully 3D, but it's a lot more cinematic. Like, especially even when you start the game, the game's not just 3D, like the camera will shift, will pan. There's one part where the camera is like embedded in a broken fence. When you see a dinosaur like break the glass, they actually really took care of a lot of these things that, even for this time, like right now, for the video version, we're watching the reveal of a dead body. And in the game, that's a big deal, right? Because that's when you're like, oh, we haven't seen the dinosaurs yet,
here.
but you know what's going to happen. And that buildup is something that Resident Evil did a lot more jump scares. Like with Resident Evil, I can say, well, that's when like the dog breaks the glass. But you didn't get like a cinematic approach. That just kind of happened. With Silent Hill, you have the fog, and you can listen, you can hear, there's the radio and all that stuff, but here, the camera is actually part of the experience. I don't know if you guys felt like they actually did do a good job with that here.
I do think they did, and another thing to go towards its like cinematicness of it that I think they did really well is, even though the T-Rex as this boss isn't the most intricate or interesting thing, I do think they made every moment very memorable and like cinematic. As you said, they really kind of build up to that final encounter of the T-Rex, and I think that was a super well done thing, because it chases you one time, it breaks through a window, it chases you. It looks like it's the end of the game when the helicopter crashes and all that. Like, that's almost like a final boss sequence, and then like it dies and comes back, and there's just all these twists and turns with like building up to the final encounter with the T-Rex, and it felt very like blockbuster movie like, and I think they did a super good job with that. I mean, the game in terms of bosses, there's really no bosses aside from the T-Rex, so that's a definite weak point, but the one boss I thought they built up very well.
I would almost argue they did it better than they did with Nemesis in RE3, just because it's the concept is the same, but they kind of go off the path with Nemesis a little later in the game.
Something that we didn't mention in the overall review, and I want to know if it was just me, how can that dinosaur be so damn quick at the end of the game? Can somebody explain that to me?
Oh yeah, he is gunning through that water.
Oh yeah,
how?
Plot convenience. Those little,
you're in a freaking hovercraft.
Those little
For those
arms
that haven't
can't
played
do
the
much,
game.
but those big old legs can just gun them right there.
Yeah, people, you're in a freaking hovercraft, it is, right? And you're just blazing speed. And then there's just like huge freaking T-Rex. He's like chasing you. I mean, you can tell like the animation, he's not even moving fast.
Yeah.
But the water's just moving so quickly. I started bursting out laughing. I'm like, come
There's a
on,
reason
man.
you can't see like his legs underneath the water because he'd be like moving so ridiculously fast.
I would have loved to see that. So, any other things that you think Dino Crisis did better than Silent Hill or Ori?
I do have something. I will say that maybe you guys will argue with me on this one, but I'm going to say the voice acting in this game was better than Silent Hill 1 and
I'd agree.
And Resident Evil 2 and 3. I think this actually, okay, is it amazing? No, but like I think Regina and Gale all pretty well voice acted. I don't know if the scientist was a little cliche, but whatever. It's a game of that time.
But the other characters, I think they did a good job because you have Regina, who's the person in the middle, and then you have the hero on one side and the logical person in the other one. And I think their performances did capture that. Whereas I think with the other ones, like Silent Hill, look, I love playing those games, but we're not talking about the voiceover being a good reason to play
Silent Hill
those.
1 has some really awkward voice acting, which can kind of work to its eeriness, but if we're just talking sounding like a natural human being, I think Dino Crisis actually does the best job out of the games we played for the podcast.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because even though the characters are very much action movie cliches, almost every one of them, there's enough range and emotion in their voice that you're able to differentiate what exactly the cliche that they're falling into. With a lot of these other survival horror games on the PS1, it's very one note, and then you almost have the comedic scene where they're trying to get the emotion across, but it just comes off as laughable.
Before we get to the cons or things that are maybe not so great, something that I thought was very interesting, and I kept looking up articles just thinking what are the odds, is the average beat time for this and Ori and Silent Hill are incredibly similar. And I would love to ask you, why. So for context, it took me almost 9 hours to beat the game. I don't know about you guys. What was your average beat time, more or less?
It was around 8.5 hours.
Yeah, I was in the 7-8 hour spectrum.
Okay, so obviously these numbers vary because, as people get better at playing this, it'll change. But even then, the average beat time for Dino Crisis 1 is 6.5 hours. RE2 is 6. RE3 is 6.5. Silent Hill is 7. And then Silent Hill 2 is 8. I think it is fascinating in a time where people are like, hey, if a game is not a 40-hour experience, it's not worth playing. Yet these games are like, hey, hold my game controller. It's I want to have the shortest experience that's maybe replayable. Maybe you want to enjoy some things. Do you think that average 6 to, let's say, 10 hours, right, especially for a first time playing, do you think that is the perfect length for this type of game? What do you think that common theme is a thing?
I think that is, if it was any longer, it would overstay its welcome, because a lot of these games, especially from the PS1 era, they were built on replayability, because once you beat it for the first time, then you unlock a new mode or a new items or a new difficulty, and they give you the incentive to go back and do it again. And especially with the Resident Evil games where they rank you at the end of them, it's okay, you got a B this time. Well, I want to go back and do an A, and it incentivizes you to go faster. And the thing about going faster in these games, and I think this is why it ends up being the way it is and so close, the better you get at these games, the less you actually engage with it. There comes a point where you learn the mechanics, and instead of having to shoot the dinosaurs or the zombies, you just run past the dinosaurs and the zombies. So it basically turns into a speed simulator, and I imagine that would be why they end up being pretty close, because it's just how fast can I run and avoid everything through those games.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because even myself, after playing Ori and Silent Hill, the first thing I thought of in Dino Crisis is, I don't need to shoot them. And I didn't. It's very rare where I actually needed to destroy, even if a dinosaur was in the way, I was okay, I'll just go back to the other room, come right back, and he spawned differently. And once you get with those mechanics, like, we are not speedrunners, right? But I feel like that's similar to what a speedrunner goes, which is forget about the game, how it looks, how is it designed, how does the AI perform? And once you figure out those things, like the dinosaurs for me, I never felt threatened, even though I did die a couple times. And something else that I do think is positive with this game is it is a little bit more forgiving. Even in normal, you can get the resuscitation. So even if you die, you spawn in the previous room with your stuff intact. Yep. And even if you like lose all of that, you still have like 5 continues. So for somebody like myself, where I hadn't saved for like a good while, at one point I died and I forgot about the resuscitation. I started yelling. I'm like, oh, I got 2 of them. It's going to be okay.
Amateur mistake.
Yeah, that item was amazing. I really appreciated that. And I never got a game over because of those. Again, I'm Mr. Easy over here.
Yeah, I was going to say that's why you didn't.
I know. I got an asterisk next to my playthrough. We did Resident Evil 3 on easy. I didn't get crap that time. Okay.
You don't got to justify, right? You don't got to justify.
All
It's
right,
okay.
all right.
It's
You guys
all,
making me feel
just
insecure.
crap. That's all.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, resuscitation was a nice quality of life addition that I really appreciated, because these games, it's like all that's doing is wasting your time if you get a game over there, because then it's like I already know what to do, and it's not like it's difficult. I just have to go back and go through all those sections again. Yeah. And in this case, because they're pretty generous with those, and if you, as long as you're not being a reckless moron, chances are you won't get game over too many times, so it'll just be a much smoother experience.
Plus, I think even though we didn't play it multiple times, well, at least I didn't, for review, once you get to that second and third playthrough, like, that's basically what the game has, so it really needs to keep you flowing, and I think the resuscitations go a long way with that. Because once you figure out, like, a puzzle is difficult once, right? If you're playing through the game again, it's just a matter of how fast can I beat this puzzle, and you don't really get that experience a second time. So the fact that they add that little bit of a quote-unquote crutch and make the game smooth, like a smooth experience when you just have the action, I think it goes a long way.
That's true. And we've had a chance to talk about some of the positives. Now, if you were to think about cons, things that specifically irked you about this game, were not as good, were either just slightly below or far worse, starting with Keith, especially I feel like this is when we really do have to compare it with Resident Evil, because once again, it is Capcom. What is like the first thing that comes to mind?
It's the action with a giant bullet behind it, where I think the fact that I mentioned it when we were talking about the game, and I couldn't say Resident Evil, but the fact that you have dinosaurs there and the one enemy that you're facing is a raptor, there's no cooldown period to the action. It's always kind of going at that blazing pace until the point you just kind of figure it out. So in the Resident Evil games, you have the zombies, you have your lickers, you have your hunters, you have the lower enemies that you're able to get a bunch of thrown at you and kind of deal, like, you're not dealing with the difficulty of the enemy, you're dealing with the number of the enemies that are behind you, and it adds a little bit of variety that way, so you're not just facing the hard thing constantly in every room. And in Dino Crisis, it very much is that, where you're facing raptor after raptor after raptor, and you don't have all of the resources to deal with everything, so there's no cooldown period to it, and it's cool for a little while, but it becomes very, like, it grinds at you after a while, and that's very, like, I felt that very much after the helicopter scene of, like, okay, let's just get to it. I know, okay, there's another room, more enemies, let's just get through it and get to the puzzle, and it got to me very much near the end of the game.
That's a good observation. Something that I'd like to quickly bring up for me that I'm not going to say was worse. I think it made me feel more detached. What I loved about Silent Hill is, to me, Silent Hill was story first, gameplay second, and everything else afterwards. For me, this game, it's like, if you were to ask me what is like my favorite thing about Dino Crisis, I'd have to be like, it's kind of like a tie, but not like a number one, right? It's like everything is like a really good number three, because Silent Hill, the story is about the character, right? I'm playing as the main character. I want to figure out something about myself. With Dino Crisis, it's I'm on a mission to go hear about other people's things. So even though I have some conflict, I'm detached from it. Even though Resident Evil, you're a cop, depending on the Resident Evil, it's either like your first day or something. There's still like a camaraderie, or, there's family involved in some of the games. And that to me feels more connected. Whereas with this game, it's like, man, for a scientist, like, I don't like the scientist voiceover. I don't care about the person that I'm trying to find in the game, like the main purpose.
Yeah.
So Regina to me comes off as like, I'm a vessel for the story, but I don't just want to be a vessel. I want to be part of the story. And I didn't feel as compelled. Like Silent Hill and even Resident Evil, when I stopped playing, I'd be thinking about like, oh, where are we going next? Like, what's going to happen in the story here? At no point did I ever feel like, oh, what's going to happen in the story now? It's like, well, more dinosaurs, and eventually you're going to find the scientist. I mean, it's going to happen, and you're just going through the motions.
Third energy.
I definitely agree with you on that, Juan. The story, because at the end of the day, these games, as much as I enjoy the clunky gameplay and the tank controls, really, they're only as good as their story, right? Because the story is what ultimately kind of carries these. Because the action, some of the gun gameplay can be a little fun in these types of survival horror games, and definitely the variety of weapons is pretty limited in this game. But at the end of the day, I think Resident Evil and Silent Hill do a much better job of that whole world building and story aspect, right? Where Resident Evil has this zombie apocalypse basically happening, and you have this overarching story about this umbrella corporation that you want to learn more of, and you're kind of unraveling that mystery. And then Silent Hill has, in the first one, it's about this kind of death cult or whatever, and you're trying to figure out what the heck's going on and why the town is seeing all this craziness. Silent Hill 2 is much more like a personal character's journey. But either way, like, both series have this kind of like overarching like mystery and allure to them, where Dino Crisis, they try to build some mystery with like what's going on with the dinosaurs, but they kind of just give you an answer, and it's really not it's not like the most compelling mystery either, because going in there's dinosaurs, and you're like, okay, yeah, it's Jurassic Park, whatever. It just doesn't have that like I said, world building or any type of lore that's like sucks you in quite like those two series do,
It's true. And then they give you like the most definitive answer where there's no mystery left. It's like, this is exactly why the dinosaurs are there, and you need to get rid of the thing that makes the dinosaurs happen.
And I actually feel like that was to its detriment, because even though I thought that was the most intriguing part of the story, it's such a throwaway. Like, you can take out the whole, portal thing from the past, and that's why they're in the current times. Even when you have that information, usually when you get new access, you're like, oh, I expect to see a portal now with like a dozen dinosaurs going in, right? I got to close the portal to get
They come
millions.
in like the end of Avengers. Like.
Yep.
Yeah, literally.
You just see Regina fly up through the portal and throw the bomb in it.
That would be amazing. Instead, literally nothing changes.
If you find that amazing, what if I told you in number 2 they doubled down on it in like the hardest way possible?
That actually doesn't sound bad.
Play.
Like, if they lean into it more, I'm like, yes.
Oh.
Apparently, Dino Crisis 3, they just went into space, and
I never played 3.
That's when they jumped the shark.
I heard that they
jumped the dinosaur, right?
Yeah, they jumped the dinosaur in that one. I've never played 3, and I've only heard awful things about it, but 2 is awesome. Oh, 2 is so good. I think. I don't know. I thought 1 was really good before playing it.
When's the last time you played 2?
When it first came out. or around then. I remember going to a Blockbuster and renting it for a weekend.
So it was that long ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Keith, that was in the year 2000.
Okay, but let me tell you
2000.
this. What if they harness third energy and accidentally send a city back through time?
Is that what actually happens?
No, that's the plot of Dino Crisis 2.
Okay, I'm actually interested in that.
Same here.
It's
Wow,
awesome.
yeah, like you mentioned that, and I think that's the most commending thing, and something that, if anything, we gotta be a little bit more lenient, not to justify, but I already mentioned, the timeline as far as releases. So by the time this game came out in '99, they already had context from at least Resident Evil 1. And then 2 back in '98. Now, maybe that doesn't give them a lot of time to develop and change stuff, but considering the fact that it's all Capcom, and it's not like nowadays where, one game can have thousands of people working on a game, I would imagine that even some people that will work on RE2 will be like, hey, maybe for Dino Crisis, we can take this, we can take some of that. And, we saw the evolution of that. I think that when Dino Crisis came out, that's when we got Silent Hill that same year. We got Resident Evil 3 just a little while after. And even though RE3 I don't think was better or worse than RE2, I think it was just more action-oriented. We did talk about that. That's available now in the archives. We did get a Dino Crisis 2. We did get a Dino Crisis 3. And even if they are better or worse, this is the first installment. So if you were to judge this game in comparison to Resident Evil 1, especially with you, Keith, like, how would you fare this game compared to the first one?
That's really hard, just because of it's so like building on top of each other in my mind. So from that, I guess this would have been like regardless of where they went with the franchise, I think that this game is a stronger start to a series than Resident Evil 1 was, because Resident Evil 1 was a good game that just like it really hit its stride in the second one, but I think that Dino Crisis 1 is a stronger introduction to the idea that they have going forward. And what happened, but looking at this on its own, I would say that it is a stronger introduction to the Dino Crisis game. It's not a better game. It's a stronger introduction because it is not a better game than Resident Evil 1, and my God, is it not a better game than Resident Evil 2.
So something worth considering, I know people look at review scores, and I know that's all subjective, right? But I do think it's at least intriguing from an outsider's perspective. So Dino Crisis 1 got a 74%. Dino Crisis 2 got 86. So we're talking about a significant increase. And then Dino Crisis 3, which came out in 2003 on the OG Xbox, got a 51. So I do think it's something worth mentioning. And another thing that's also worth mentioning is this game came out on the Dreamcast. Like, we all played the PS1 version for the sake of this review, right?
Yes. Although I should have used it as an excuse to dust off my Dreamcast and play it.
Man,
but I'm sure it would have ran better.
When did that come out for the Dreamcast? Was that?
Dreamcast was 2000, so it didn't come out the same year. At least the release date here is the year 2000, so it came out afterwards.
Okay.
It'd be interesting to see, like, if you can look up the release date of the version on Dreamcast, because I'd be curious to see how close it came out to the second one. Because that'd be something that's
because the thing that I'm interested in here, which I'm currently looking up, is how close did it come out to Code Veronica on the Dreamcast? Because there are, if we're going
Capcom
back,
was just churning out these.
I know
games.
they really
and
just.
Those are some of the same developers, actually. Some of the same people that worked on RE4, for example, and some of the people that worked on this also worked on Code Veronica. So
because I didn't even bring it up earlier, but going back to my conversation of things that they took from from Dino Crisis, and then kind of like used them forward in Resident Evil games, when you were talking about the camera angles and how it's a more 3D, not just a background environment, like that's what separates Code Veronica from the PlayStation 1 Resident Evil games. The fact that the camera just wasn't in one fixed position, it moved with you. So that's another thing you have to give Dino Crisis props for.
We didn't even talk about the danger sequences either, like basically the precursor to like the RE4 QuickTime events, right?
Yeah, so
like,
that's true.
Okay. I'm curious here. Just first impressions. So that is a feature. But if you were to say neutral, pro, or con, where would you rank the action sequences or danger ones?
The danger ones? Me personally, I would say they were a pro because it was before it became outdated and gimmicky towards the end of like the PS3 generation, like that time. But they didn't overuse it, right? It wasn't like, oh, God of War, like I gotta smack all these buttons to, kill the Hydra or whatever. It was like very select moments, and they only did it a few times throughout the game. And so I thought it was actually really well done.
I agree. The fact that they showed a little bit of restraint and only had it in select moments, I think goes a long way to make it like it wasn't a crutch that they used, and it was a way to break up the action. So I appreciated when they showed up.
Absolutely. And just for context, Code Veronica came out on the Dreamcast on February 2000. So I don't have the specific release date for Dino Crisis, but Code Veronica came out at the beginning of the year. So
it was November of 2000, so it came out significantly later.
That's actually quite
crazy
fascinating.
That Code Veronica came out in February of 2000. Like, that's right after Resident Evil 3. Like, we're talking
complain
months
about games like
point.
oversaturation now.
Holy crap.
I know. Well, I'm pretty sure RE3 was being developed simultaneously, right? With Code Veronica.
But that means, like, thinking about timeline-wise, like, you have to imagine that at one point in Capcom's history, Dino Crisis, Resident Evil 3, and Code Veronica were all in some form of development, and that's nuts.
Yeah. Well, wasn't it RE3, like, they were basically using a lot of RE2 assets, and it was kind of like a last-minute decision to make it? Wasn't it supposed to be like an expansion or something? I remember.
Yeah, Code Veronica is supposed to be more of the actual 3, right?
Yeah, but they needed something to fill the gap, and we'll use gaps in quotations there.
I was going to say, to fill the gap.
They needed some more of that money.
They're just cranking these games out, and they somehow have a gap compared to, like, now how many years do we have to wait between, like, sequels?
No kidding.
So, to conclude the conversation, if you were to say Dino Crisis has more cons or more pros than, let's say, your Resident Evil or Silent Hill, when you put things on a balance on a personal level, like this is all subjective on each one, right? Would you say it has more, about the same, or what's your take with Ryan?
I don't want to say like, oh, it's got more cons or more pros. I would mainly say that, it ranks below both Resident Evil and Silent Hill. I think gameplay wise, for the most part, it, like, from a technical and gameplay standpoint, it pretty much stands toe to toe with the other games, minus a few features. It's really, in my opinion, where it falls short is the lore and the world building, and, the characters. That's, I would forgive some of the other lesser faults if it had those captivating me a lot more. Because at the end of the day, that's what really sucks me into the worlds of these games, is that kind of the lore and everything behind it. So I would rank it below, but I think it does a lot of things right.
Yeah, I have to agree with that, where if we're talking about like the pros versus cons in compared to the other games, I would rank it lower, and I guess say it has more cons and things that I don't like. But the things that it does right, I have nothing but respect for Dino Crisis 4. Like, if you take the great elements of this game and think about how it moved the other survival horror games forward, like, I have nothing but respect for Dino Crisis in that way, and I appreciate the fact that it exists, but it's only to make the things I love just a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And even though I didn't love my time with the game, but kind of like what Keith said, I looked at the game and thought to myself, hey, I have experienced this better in a future game, but this was the stepping stone. I think there's always like necessary stepping stones. When the first Assassin's Creed game came out, a lot of people said, hey, there's potential, but the word is boring for a lot of people. Then Assassin's Creed 2 came out, and I don't think we need to talk about. Exactly. Like it changed gaming in many ways, for better or worse, but it definitely changed it, right? So for those that are checking us out on the podcast feed, thank you so much for supporting us in these episodes. If you're checking this out on YouTube and you've not checked out the previous part, we actually have a full review of Dino Crisis, because all of you, we just really want to hang out. Like, that's why we can't plug the Discord enough.
It's all about the conversations, Juan.
It's all about the conversation, people.
Hashtag follow the conversation.
Exactly, people. It's all about that. And where can they continue that conversation, Mr. McNulty?
Well, one would have to guess would be acastofthepast.com/Discord, where you can come and chat with us about a multitude of topics. We've got a video game section, TCG, Lego, because we got Brickhouse Hamilton over there building Legos every Wednesday on his Twitch channel. But we talk about a bunch of things. Plenty of great members of the community posting their game pickups and just talking about games they're playing, and pretty much any movie or whatever, any topic that comes up. But obviously, video games, movies, kind of our bread and butter.
Absolutely. And if all of you want to check out our individual content, Keith does have a Twitch channel at twitch.tv/BrickHouseHamilton. Because Ryan, you gotta say it with style. You can't just say Brickhouse Hamilton. Come on, Ryan, give it some spice. Come on.
All right. He's a brick house.
Oh yeah,
there it is.
There you go. And
don't
then,
sue us.
Ryan is a Zelda expert. He's got like 40 tier lists. He probably made 2 tier lists while we were recording this very episode.
If you have questions about the timeline of Zelda, he has answers.
Exactly.
He's explained it to me at least 5 times, and I still don't have those answers.
These two guys got sick of hearing me talk about Zelda, so I just started talking to a wall and hit the record button, and that's my new channel.
If you want to know about Zelda and Ryan, you can check it out at youtube.com/game essays. That's game ESSAYS. And then in my case, I have my channel, which is youtube.com/playerjuan with discussion videos, or playerjuan plays if you just want to check out some gameplay sessions, a lot of a lot of Super Nintendo association, Super Nintendo, PS3, and some Xbox 360 stuff. So thank you so much. I'm really happy we had this conversation, and as a podcast, we continue we have like this side project with survival horror, right? Where it's like we started off with a couple of games, but we have a list. Like we talked about and reviewed Resident Evil 2 and 3, the original ones, Silent Hill 1 and 2, and then we have this. So it'll be interesting to see which other ones people would love for us to check out. So please send us a tweet, a cast of the past, or on the Discord you can drop some of those suggestions.
And why is it Silent Hill 3?
It's almost like it may happen.
It's almost like it might happen in October.
Yeah, it might. And it's going to be happening. So thank you, everybody, so much. Hope you truly enjoyed this conversation. And we'll be back with another exciting, sexy, Brickhouse Hamilton filled edition of A Cast
to the
Past.
How is that house, Keith? That seems stiff.
We're building it brick by brick right now, but eventually we're going to get there.
Brick by Brick. Wasn't that a song in the Lego Island game?
Probably.
Hey, thanks for checking out the video. If you liked it, please consider subscribing, and we are also available on podcast feeds. So search the name, click on the Sword and Stone, and enjoy a brand new episode every single Sunday.